Millionaire's son was dumb until the black maid fed him honey and something shocking happened. The Carrington estate stood on the hill like a monument to wealth, white marble pillars, sprawling gardens, and windows tall enough to swallow a person whole. It was the kind of place where silence was normal, and laughter had long been forgotten. Inside lived Victor Carrington, a man whose name alone could open any door in the country. He had built an empire in real estate, but his fortune did not shield him from the pain that quietly shadowed his family. Victor had a son, Adrian Carrington, a boy of 7 with blue eyes like clear glass and a face that seemed carved by innocence itself. But Adrian never spoke, not a word. Doctors from every corner of the world had flown into the mansion at Victor's expense. Some blamed a developmental disorder, others suggested trauma from birth. A few whispered he might never speak at all, each left with a fat check and polite words of condolence, but none gave the Carrington family the miracle they craved. Victor despised the very word miracle. To him, life was about strategy, money, and control, not divine intervention. He would scoff whenever his wife, Isabella, lit candles in the chapel praying for their son's voice to be released. "Prayers don't build skyscrapers, Isabella," he would say coldly. "If Adrian ever speaks, it'll be because of science, not some fairy-tale miracle." And so the mansion lived in sorrow. Adrian moved like a shadow, often sitting by the grand piano where his tiny fingers traced silent melodies. He would look at his father with yearning eyes as if words were trapped behind his lips, begging for release. But Victor turned away, drowning his disappointment in business deals and expensive wine. Into this world walked Elizabeth Monroe, a tall black woman with warm brown eyes and a quiet strength in her voice. She had recently moved from Atlanta, looking for work after the sudden passing of her own mother. Though she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, life had placed her in the uniform of a maid. Still, she carried herself with dignity, her presence soft but commanding. On her first day at the Carrington mansion, Elizabeth noticed Adrian. He was sitting by the fountain in the garden, hands wrapped around a small wooden toy horse staring at the water. She approached gently. "Hello, young man," she said, her voice calm as summer rain. Adrian blinked, looked at her, then turned away. He made no sound. When Victor introduced Elizabeth to the household staff, he was curt. "This is Elizabeth. She will handle the boy when necessary. Don't expect miracles from her. Her job is cleaning, not curing." Elizabeth said nothing, but her heart stirred. She could see the boy's silence was more than just a medical condition. It was sorrow, a wall built around something fragile. Over the weeks, Elizabeth grew closer to Adrian. She discovered he liked honey. Whenever she served him toast with a drizzle of golden sweetness, his face would brighten ever so slightly. It was the only food that seemed to comfort him. Elizabeth remembered her grandmother once saying, "Honey carries the voice of the earth. Feed it to a child in silence and it might awaken the tongue." It was an old Southern belief, half superstition, half tradition. Elizabeth wasn't sure she believed it, but whenever she gave Adrian honey, she saw something change in his eyes. One afternoon, Elizabeth found him struggling to hum. His lips moved, but no sound came. She leaned closer. "You want to speak, don't you?" she whispered. Adrian's eyes welled with tears, and he shook his head violently as if afraid. When she reached out to comfort him, he pushed her hand away. That resistance cut her deeply, but she understood. The boy didn't trust hope anymore. Too many doctors had promised, too many people had stared at him like a puzzle instead of a child. One night, Isabella found Elizabeth in the kitchen, stirring tea. "Elizabeth, you spend time with Adrian. Do you think he will ever?" Isabella's voice broke. Elizabeth hesitated. She wanted to say yes, but she remembered Victor's icy glare and the danger of raising false hopes. "I don't know, ma'am, but I do know he's listening to the world around him. He feels more than people think." Isabella clutched her hands. "If you can do anything to help him, please don't stop. Victor won't believe in miracles, but I do, and I believe God sent you here for a reason." Elizabeth nodded slowly. She couldn't explain why, but she felt the same. Days later, she tried something small. She brought Adrian a spoon of honey, not on bread but plain, letting the sunlight stream through the jar as she spoke softly. "This is the voice of flowers, Adrian. Taste it, and maybe the flowers will sing through you." She placed the spoon near his lips. At first he resisted, shaking his head. Then, with trembling fingers, he took it. The honey glistened, golden and alive as it touched his tongue. For a fleeting moment, his lips parted and a sound escaped, just a broken syllable, but it was there. Elizabeth gasped. Adrian's eyes widened in fear and he clutched his throat as if shocked by what had just happened. Tears ran down his cheeks and he fled to his room, slamming the door shut. Elizabeth stood frozen. Had she imagined it? No, she had heard something, however faint. Her heart raced. When Elizabeth told Isabella, joy lit up her face, but when Victor overheard, his expression hardened. "You're filling my wife's head with nonsense," he snapped. "Honey doesn't cure speechlessness. Next you'll tell me you can pray away cancer." "Sir, I only said I heard something," Elizabeth replied calmly. "And I say you're delusional," Victor barked. "Adrian doesn't need maids with superstitions, he needs science. If I hear any more of this, you'll be out of this house." Elizabeth bowed her head, but inside she knew the truth. Adrian's voice was there, hidden, waiting to be freed. That night, as the house slept, Elizabeth heard a faint sound from Adrian's room. She crept to the door and paused. Inside, the boy sat by the window, clutching the honey jar. His lips moved slowly, painfully. A broken whisper formed. "Moth." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't full, but it was the beginning. And it was only the beginning of something far greater than anyone in the mansion could imagine. The morning sun spilled through the Carrington estate like a painter's brush across white marble floors. The house, usually so quiet, carried an unusual undercurrent. Elizabeth Monroe awoke with a restless heart. She could not shake the sound she had heard the night before, the faint, broken whisper of Adrian trying to form a word. Ma. That single syllable clung to her like a haunting melody. It wasn't just noise, it was hope, raw and trembling. Elizabeth dressed in her uniform, smoothing her apron, and made her way to the kitchen. Isabella was already there, her face glowing with expectation. "You heard it too," Isabella whispered eagerly, clasping Elizabeth's hands. Elizabeth nodded. "I did." He tried, he wanted to speak. It was weak, but it was real. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years she smiled with the unrestrained joy of a mother. But before Elizabeth could say more, Victor's footsteps echoed down the corridor like thunder. He entered the kitchen, suit jacket draped neatly, his face carved in stone. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, suspicion already in his tone. Isabella turned quickly, hiding her wet eyes. "Nothing important, Victor, just household matters." Victor's gaze swept from his wife to Elizabeth, narrowing as if he could pierce through the silence between them. "Good, I have no patience for foolish talk this morning. There's a board meeting in an hour and I expect everything here to run smoothly in my absence." With that, he strode out, but the heaviness he left behind lingered. Isabella clutched Elizabeth's hand once more. "Please," she whispered desperately, "don't stop. Whatever you're doing, don't stop. Even if Victor doesn't believe, Adrian needs you." Elizabeth nodded, her throat tightening. "I promise, ma'am." Later that day, Elizabeth found Adrian in the garden. He sat beneath the old oak tree, the honey jar clutched in his lap. His little fingers smeared with its golden stickiness as he stared off into the distance. Elizabeth knelt beside him. "Adrian," she said softly, "may I sit with you?" He didn't turn his head, but his small body shifted, allowing her space. She took that as a yes. For a long while they sat in silence, the wind carrying the gentle sound of rustling leaves. Elizabeth spoke slowly, as if talking to herself. "When I was a girl, my grandmother would tell me stories. She said honey held the secrets of the earth, that it carried whispers from flowers, trees, even the sun. I didn't believe her at first, but then one day I realized she wasn't just talking about honey, she was talking about hope." Adrian blinked, his glass blue eyes finally meeting hers. He raised the honey jar and pushed it toward her, as if asking her to continue. Elizabeth smiled. "Would you like to try again?" The boy hesitated, his lips pressing tight. Fear flickered in his eyes, fear of disappointment, of failing again. Elizabeth reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand gently. "It's okay," she whispered. "Even the strongest voices start as whispers. We can do it together." She dipped a spoon into the honey, lifting it toward him. The sunlight caught the golden liquid, turning it into something almost holy. Adrian licked it slowly, closing his eyes. Elizabeth leaned closer. "Say ma, just like last night, ma." His lips trembled, soundless at first, but then, like a door creaking open, came the faintest whisper. "Ma." Elizabeth's heart leapt. She clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with tears. Yes, yes, Adrian, you did it. But before she could celebrate further, Adrian's face crumpled. He covered his mouth with both hands, shaking his head violently. Tears spilled down his cheeks and he turned away, running back toward the house. Elizabeth sat frozen under the oak tree, her heart torn. She had seen the miracle, but the boy was terrified of it. That evening, dinner at the Carrington mansion was tense. Victor sat at the head of the table, swirling his wine, oblivious to the silent storm brewing within his family. Isabella picked at her food, sneaking glances at her son, who sat quietly, his head bowed. Elizabeth, standing in the corner as staff often did, noticed Adrian clutching his spoon too tightly, his knuckles white. She caught his gaze and gave him the smallest nod, a silent encouragement. Then, without warning, Adrian dropped his spoon. The sound clattered across the marble floor, drawing Victor's irritated sigh. Adrian, Victor barked, for heaven's sake, must you always? But then it happened, a small, shaky voice broke through the silence. Peepa. The word was cracked, incomplete, but unmistakable. Victor froze. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Elizabeth felt her knees weaken beneath her. Adrian looked terrified, his eyes darting from his father to his mother, then to Elizabeth. Victor's wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the table. For a long, suffocating moment, no one spoke. Then Victor rose abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. This is some trick, he snapped, his voice shaking with something between anger and fear. You, he pointed at Elizabeth. You've put ideas in his head, you've coached him, haven't you? Elizabeth's heart stung, but she stood tall. Sir, I would never. Enough, Victor thundered. I don't want this nonsense in my house. My son will not be your experiment. Isabella rose, tears spilling down her face. Victor, did you not hear? He spoke, our son spoke. But Victor's eyes were wild, almost afraid. He stormed from the dining room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Adrian's lip quivered. He pushed away from the table and ran upstairs. Isabella collapsed into her chair, sobbing quietly. Elizabeth remained where she was, her heart heavy. She knew what she had witnessed was real, but convincing Victor Carrington would be harder than she ever imagined. That night, the mansion was alive with whispers. The staff had heard the rumors. The boy spoke, some said in disbelief, others muttered darker things. One maid whispered to another, I heard Elizabeth gave him honey and then he started speaking. My grandmother used to say honey could be used for charms. What if she's dabbling in something unnatural? Another shook her head nervously. Careful, you don't want to be caught saying such things, but it is strange, isn't it? Elizabeth overheard them as she passed by, her chest tightening. She had known her actions might stir suspicion, but she hadn't expected it so soon. In her small quarters that night, she knelt by her bed and prayed. Lord, you know my heart. I only want to help this child. Give me strength when others see darkness where there is only light. As she prayed, a faint sound broke through the silence. She looked up. There at her door stood Adrian in his nightclothes, holding the honey jar. His blue eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Ma, he whispered again, this time clearer. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She rushed to him, pulling him into her arms. Yes, Adrian, she whispered through sobs. Yes, you can speak, you will speak. The boy clung to her tightly, as though for the first time in his life someone had given him permission to hope. But outside the cracked door, a shadow lingered. One of the older servants had been watching, and what she saw would soon spread through the estate like wildfire. The next morning, Victor summoned Elizabeth to his study. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and Victor's face was darker than she had ever seen it. You will cease whatever you are doing with my son immediately, he said, his tone cold as ice. Elizabeth straightened her back. Sir, your son has a voice, he only needs encouragement if you'd just. Victor slammed his hand against the desk. Enough, I will not have this house turned into a stage for superstitious nonsense. If you value your position here, you'll remember your place. Elizabeth's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. With respect, sir, this isn't about me, this is about Adrian, he's trying, can't you see that? But Victor's face only hardened further. What I see is a maid who's forgotten her station. You are dismissed for the day, do not go near my son. Elizabeth's chest ached as she left the study. Outside the door, she saw Isabella standing, her eyes wide with sorrow. "Don't give up," Isabella whispered. "Please, for Adrian's sake, don't give up." Elizabeth nodded faintly, but inside, fear gnawed at her. She knew Adrian's voice was a miracle in the making. But to bring it forth, she would have to battle not just the boy's silence, but the doubts, fears, and prejudices of everyone around them. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the cost of this miracle would be far greater than anyone could yet imagine. The Carrington mansion had always been a fortress of wealth and silence. But after that night at the dining table, after Adrian's trembling whisper broke years of muteness, the air within those marble walls began to change. Change, however, did not come quietly, it came with whispers. The servants spoke in hushed tones as they polished silver or scrubbed the endless marble floors. Their voices floated like shadows down the grand hallways. "They say the boy spoke. With his own mouth," I heard Mrs. Carrington crying with joy. "But it happened after the maid gave him honey. Strange, isn't it, honey of all things? Some called it a blessing, others a trick, and a few in fear began to call it something darker." Elizabeth felt the weight of every glance as she moved about her duties. Where once her presence had been met with indifference, now eyes followed her, some curious, others suspicious. One morning, while she was scrubbing the staircase, two younger maids passed by. They thought Elizabeth could not hear them. "My aunt used to say honey could be used in charms, spells," one whispered. The other crossed herself. "Do you think Elizabeth is?" "Hush," the first hissed, "don't let her hear, but it's not natural, I tell you. A boy mute for 7 years suddenly speaking after 1 spoon of honey, that's not medicine, that's sorcery." Elizabeth closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She had expected disbelief, but fear, that was dangerous. Fear could spread faster than truth. That evening, Isabella entered Elizabeth's small room quietly, her silk gown trailing behind her. She looked fragile, her beauty tired by years of sorrow and Victor's coldness. "Elizabeth," she said softly, "they're talking." "I know," Elizabeth replied, folding the sheets neatly on her bed. "I hear it in their voices, see it in their eyes." Isabella sat down, clasping her hands together. "They think you're unnatural," she paused. "They think you're a witch." Elizabeth's chest tightened. She had heard the word whispered before, but from Isabella's lips it struck deeper. "Ma'am, I'm no witch," Elizabeth said firmly, her voice trembling only slightly. "I only gave the boy honey and love, that's all." Isabella reached for her hand. "I know, I believe you, but Victor, if he hears these rumors," she shook her head, fear clouding her eyes, "he will send you away, and Adrian will lose the only person who's ever made him believe he can be whole." Elizabeth squeezed Isabella's hand gently. "Then we cannot let these whispers grow louder than the truth. The boy is speaking, that's what matters." Isabella nodded, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of dread. The very next day, Adrian himself brought the tension to a breaking point. Victor had returned early from his business trip, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble as he strode into the study. Adrian was sitting on the carpet with his toy horse, humming softly under his breath. At first, Victor thought it was just a tune from the phonograph upstairs, but then he stopped. The sound was too close, too real. Adrian's lips moved as he hummed, the notes uneven but present. When Victor approached, the boy froze, wide-eyed. "Adrian," Victor whispered, almost afraid of the sound of his own voice, "were you humming?" The boy's lips parted. His small voice, shaky but audible, formed a word. "Pie." Victor staggered back as though struck. For years he had given up hope, resigned himself to raising a son without words. Now here it was, his voice, fragile but alive. But instead of joy, anger boiled up inside him. Anger at the doctors who had failed. Anger at Isabella's prayers. And most of all, anger at the maid who had dared to tamper with his son's fate. That evening he summoned Elizabeth once more. His study was heavy with smoke, his eyes cold as he leaned across the desk. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said. Elizabeth stood tall. "I think your son is learning to speak. With honey, with your grandmother's folk tales." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Do you take me for a fool, Miss Monroe?" Elizabeth swallowed hard, but she did not look away. "With patience, with care, with someone who believes in him, that's all." Victor slammed his fist on the desk. Enough of this nonsense. If Adrian speaks, it will be because of the specialists I pay millions for, not because of a maid feeding him sugar and fairy tales. Elizabeth's voice softened, but her words cut sharper than steel. All your millions could not give him what he gave you today, a word. You didn't hear him by accident, sir. You heard him because he wants to speak. He wants you to believe in him. Victor's face hardened, his pride stung. Get out before I throw you out myself. Elizabeth left quietly, but her heart was heavy. She knew she was walking a line that could cost her everything. Later that night, as storms rolled across the horizon, Adrian crept once more into her room. His little frame shivered in the candlelight, honey jar tucked under his arm. "Ma," he whispered, then paused, his lips trembling. "M.S.E." Elizabeth's tears fell freely. "Elizabeth," she finished softly, "that's my name." He nodded shyly, as though proud of his small triumph. Elizabeth hugged him close, whispering in his ear, "You are braver than you know, Adrian, and one day your father will see it too." But she didn't notice the faint shadow moving in the corridor outside, one of the older maids again, watching, listening. Feeding the fire of rumors that would soon blaze through the estate. The next morning, Victor's sister, Margaret Carrington, arrived unannounced. She was a sharp-featured woman dressed in pearls and disdain who carried herself like she owned every room she entered. When she heard the whispers that Adrian had begun to speak, her lips curled. "Impossible, that boy is cursed. I told you from the beginning, Victor, nothing can fix him." Isabella bristled. "He is not cursed, he is our son, and he is speaking now thanks to Elizabeth." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Elizabeth, the maid, don't be ridiculous, you can't honestly believe." She lowered her voice, glancing at the staff. "Do you not hear what people are saying, that she's using charms, that she's put something in that honey?" Victor's jaw tightened, torn between disbelief and pride. Margaret's words echoed the whispers already festering in his mind. "She is a servant," Margaret pressed, her voice sharp as glass. "And servants like her have their ways. Mark my words, Victor, she'll bring nothing but shame to this family." Isabella shot back, her voice trembling but firm. "If shame is believing in miracles, then I'll wear it proudly." Margaret turned to Victor, smirking. "And what will the world say, brother, that the great Victor Carrington, builder of empires, needed a maid with witchcraft to fix his son?" The words pierced him deeper than she realized. Victor Carrington, a man built on reputation, could not bear the thought of being a fool in the eyes of the world. That night, Elizabeth was called to the drawing room. Victor, Isabella, and Margaret were waiting. The air was heavy, the storm outside echoing the storm within. Victor's voice was calm, but beneath it burned a dangerous edge. "Elizabeth, my sister thinks your methods are questionable, that perhaps you're not helping Adrian but deceiving us." Elizabeth's heart pounded. "Sir, with respect, I've done nothing but care for your son. He is speaking because he wants to, not because of me. I only gave him what others never did, patience." Margaret sneered. "Patience or potions?" Isabella stood suddenly. "Enough, Margaret," Adrian spoke. "I don't care what you or anyone else thinks. I heard it with my own ears, and I will not let you tear down the woman who has given us this gift." Elizabeth's breath caught. For the first time, Isabella had spoken openly in her defense. Victor looked between the two women, torn between pride, fear, and the truth he was too stubborn to accept. He rubbed his temple and finally dismissed Elizabeth with a curt wave. As Elizabeth left the room, Margaret's whisper followed her like poison in the air. "Wedge." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she closed her door that night. She knew now the battle was no longer just about Adrian's voice, it was about her own survival. And in a house filled with wealth, secrets, and fear, truth had become the most dangerous thing of all. The Carrington estate no longer carried the stillness it once did. Silence had been its defining feature, but now every corner hummed with rumors. Servants who once passed Elizabeth with polite nods now avoided her gaze, crossing themselves quietly when she entered the room. By the third week after Adrian's first word, the whispers had become bolder. "I saw her in the garden at night, whispering over a jar of honey," one footman murmured. "She's putting spells on the boy. Mark my words, nothing good will come of it," another replied. "They should send her away before it's too late." Elizabeth felt the sting of every word. She had worked hard, carried herself with dignity, never asking for more than what was due her, yet here she was being painted as a danger. But in the middle of it all, Adhering clung to her. Every evening he came to her with the honey jar. He no longer hid it. He would sit at her feet, lips trembling but determined. "Elizabeth," he whispered one night, struggling with each syllable. Elizabeth wept as she pulled him into her arms. "Yes, Adhering, that's my name, you're doing it, sweetheart." For him, each word was a battle, but every victory, every sound was a miracle. Victor, however, grew more restless. He could not deny what he had heard. He had seen his son's lips move, had felt his world shatter when the boy said "Pa," yet instead of joy, he was consumed by suspicion. It wasn't just his pride, it was Margaret's constant whispering in his ear. "You cannot let this go on, Victor," she would insist. "Do you want society to laugh at us, to say your empire was undone by a servant woman's witchcraft, that your son was cured by superstition?" Victor would pace his study, his hands clenched. "But what if it's real?" he once muttered under his breath, almost ashamed of the thought. Margaret scoffed. "Real? You're too smart to fall for tricks. This woman is using the boy for her own gain. Can't you see it? What if she wants money, influence? What if she tries to blackmail you?" Victor never answered, but the seeds of doubt had already taken root. One stormy evening, everything came to a head. Adhering had been braver that day. He had tried stringing words together in Elizabeth's room. His little voice cracked and stumbled, but it was enough to bring tears to her eyes. "Good night, Miss Elizabeth." She hugged him tightly. "Good night, Adhering, you are stronger than you know." But just as the boy slipped out of her room, they were met by a gasp. Margaret stood at the end of the hallway, her face pale with outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. Adhering froze, his honey jar clutched to his chest. Elizabeth rose quickly, her heart racing. "He was only practicing, Miss Carrington," she explained gently. "Practicing?" Margaret spat. "Practicing your spells, you mean? I knew it, whispering in dark corridors, feeding him your cursed honey. You won't deceive me, Elizabeth, I know what you are." Adhering whimpered, shrinking back against Elizabeth's skirts. Elizabeth stood her ground. "Enough," she said firmly. "I am no witch, I am simply helping a child find his voice." Margaret sneered. "Lies, and I will not let you drag this family's name through the mud. Victor will hear of this tonight." She swept away, her pearls clinking as she moved, leaving the hallway tense with dread. True to her word, Margaret stormed into Victor's study, dragging Isabella with her. Elizabeth was summoned moments later, standing before them all as lightning cracked across the sky. Margaret's voice was sharp with triumph. "I caught her, Victor, whispering in the dark with your son, feeding him that honey as if it were some sacred potion. Can you not see what's happening? She is manipulating him, manipulating all of us." Victor's eyes burned into Elizabeth, searching, accusing. "Is this true? Were you alone with my son again after I forbade it?" Elizabeth lifted her chin. "Yes, because he came to me. He wants to speak, sir. He is speaking. All he needs is someone to listen, someone who believes." "Belief," Margaret cut in with a hiss. "That's exactly what she feeds you, foolish belief. Victor, send her away before she ruins us." Isabella stepped forward, her voice breaking. "No, she has given us what no doctor ever could. Don't you see? Adhering is speaking because of her." Victor's hand slammed against the desk. "Enough! This family will not be made a spectacle. I will not have my son paraded around like some miracle child raised by a maid with jars of honey." Elizabeth's heart trembled, but she spoke with quiet strength. "Sir, this isn't about you, it's about Adhering. He is finding his voice. Don't let your pride take it from him." The words struck deep, but Victor's pride was a fortress. His face hardened, his voice cold. "You are dismissed. Pack your things. You will leave this house tomorrow." The room fell silent. Isabella gasped, clutching Elizabeth's arm. "Victor, no, please don't do this. Adhering needs her." Margaret's lips curled in satisfaction, but Elizabeth's eyes never left Victor's. "Very well," she said softly, tears brimming but unfallen. "But know this, sir, your son's voice is not mine to give or take, it is his, and no matter what you believe, it will not be silenced again." With that, she bowed her head and left the room, her footsteps echoing like a funeral bell. That night, Adhering refused to sleep. He knocked on Elizabeth's door, tears streaking his cheeks. Elizabeth, he whispered desperately, don't go. Elizabeth knelt, holding him close. Sweetheart, I have no choice. Your father doesn't believe, but you must. Promise me, Adrian, promise me you'll keep trying even if I'm not here. The boy shook his head violently, clinging tighter. No, stay. Her own tears flowed freely now. I would stay forever if I could, but remember this, you are stronger than their doubts, stronger than their fears, and your voice is a gift no one can take away. Adrian buried his face in her shoulder, his small body trembling with sobs. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby her grandmother once sang until he finally drifted to sleep. But as Elizabeth laid him down in his bed and kissed his forehead, she whispered a vow to herself. If I must leave, I will not leave in silence. The world will hear this boy's voice if it's the last thing I do. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with tension. Elizabeth's packed bag sat by her door, the weight of finality heavy in the air. The staff whispered with a mix of relief and guilt. Isabella wept openly, refusing to come to breakfast. Victor sat at the head of the table, Margaret beside him, her smile tight with victory. But Adrian did not come down. Instead, as the family sat in strained silence, a sound echoed from the grand staircase. A small, trembling voice breaking through the walls of fear and pride. Papa, no. The word was fragile but clear. Everyone froze. Heads turned. There stood Adrian, clutching his honey jar, his blue eyes burning with courage. He pointed a tiny finger at Victor. No, go. The room was stunned into silence. Margaret's face paled. Isabella broke into sobs. Victor rose slowly, his eyes locked on his son. Adrian, he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. Adrian's lip trembled, but he repeated it stronger this time. No, go, Elizabeth, stay. Elizabeth's breath caught. The boy who had been silent for 7 years was now defending her, speaking with a courage that defied every doubt. And in that moment, the mansion was no longer silent. It was alive with the sound of a child's miracle. The Carrington mansion was no longer silent. What once felt like a tomb of wealth now echoed with a boy's fragile but growing voice. Adrian's words came slowly, unevenly, like raindrops after a long drought, but they were there. Each syllable was a victory. Each sound made Isabella cry and made Elizabeth silently thank God. But for Victor, it was a battlefield inside his mind. He heard his son say "Ma" clearly, then later whisper "home" as Elizabeth encouraged him with honey and songs. Yet Victor refused to accept it. Science had failed, and here was a maid with nothing but tradition, prayers, and honey, doing what the world's best doctors couldn't. That alone threatened everything he believed about power and control. Still, the more Adrian spoke, the more Victor couldn't ignore it. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Then he claimed Adrian was naturally improving and Elizabeth had nothing to do with it. But deep down, the cracks in his disbelief widened. The whisper that changed everything. One evening, Victor returned home from a tense board meeting. His tie was loose, his temper tighter. He stepped into the dining hall and froze. Adrian, his silent son, was sitting beside Isabella and Elizabeth. He had a spoon of honey in hand, his small fingers sticky, and with all the courage in his chest, he whispered, "Papa." The word was weak but clear. Isabella gasped and covered her mouth. Elizabeth's eyes glistened, but Victor, he staggered back as though struck by lightning. For years, he had dreamed of hearing that word, but instead of joy, a strange fear filled him. He couldn't understand how something so impossible had happened, and more dangerously, he couldn't explain it. "Say it again," Victor demanded, kneeling beside Adrian. His voice cracked for the first time in years. Adrian looked at Elizabeth, then back at his father. "Papa." Victor broke. For the first time in decades, he wrapped his son in his arms and wept. Whispers of doubt. The miracle didn't stay hidden. The Carringtons' staff whispered among themselves. Word spread to neighbors, then the town. Soon people began to ask questions. How could the boy speak after 7 years of silence? Was it the maid? Or something darker? The whispers turned venomous. Elizabeth overheard one gardener say, "Be careful with her. Folks like that, they use charms. Next thing she'll own the boy's soul." The chef muttered, "Honey, that's witchcraft in disguise." Elizabeth's heart ached. She had only loved the boy as if he were her own. But now, the same people who once ignored Adrian's silence treated his voice like a curse. Victor's dilemma. Victor was torn. On one hand, he wanted to celebrate his son's voice and shower Elizabeth with gratitude. On the other, he feared the whispers would stain the Carrington name. A billionaire with a witch under his roof, investors would flee, his empire could collapse. "Elizabeth," Victor said one night in his study, the firelight flickering across his cold eyes, "you will never speak of honey or miracles again. If anyone asks, Adrian's improvement is due to new therapy I arranged. Do you understand?" Elizabeth's chest tightened. "Sir, with all due respect, the boy's healing is not mine to hide. His voice belongs to him, not your pride." Victor slammed his fist on the desk. "I pay you to clean and serve, not to preach. If the world believes you conjured his voice, do you know what they'll do? They'll brand you a witch. They'll drag my family into scandal, and I won't have it." Elizabeth stood tall, her voice calm but steady. "I didn't conjure anything. I gave him love, I gave him honey, and God did the rest. Whether you like it or not, that's the truth." For the first time, Victor looked at her not as a servant but as a woman unafraid of him, and it unsettled him more than any business rival ever could. The invitation. The turning point came when the Carrington family received an invitation to a high society gala. Victor wanted to showcase Adrian's progress to prove his heir was no longer damaged goods. At the gala, Adrian clung to Elizabeth's hand, nervous among the sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. Cameras flashed, journalists hovered. Victor beamed, announcing, "My son, Adrian Carrington, is recovering thanks to modern therapy." The crowd clapped politely until Adrian looked at Elizabeth, then spoke softly into the microphone meant for his father. "Thank you, Miss Liz." The room went silent, heads turned. Elizabeth froze, Victor's jaw clenched in fury. "Who is she?" a woman in pearls whispered. "The maid," another replied, "the Black Maid." A ripple of judgment swept through the hall. Some looked at Elizabeth with awe, others with suspicion. To them, her role in Adrian's voice was either divine or dangerous. And just like that, Elizabeth's life at the Carrington estate was about to change forever. The Carrington Gala was supposed to be a triumph. Victor had imagined the headlines, "Carrington heir speaks after years of silence." Instead, the story twisted into something beyond his control. By morning, newspapers and gossip columns carried a different headline. "The miracle of the Maid, boy speaks for the first time." Pictures of Adrian clinging to Elizabeth's hand circulated everywhere. While some praised her as a blessing, others whispered darker things. In a town where wealth and appearances ruled, the idea of a black maid unlocking a billionaire's son's voice unsettled people. Superstitions crept in. "She must have used some old magic," one columnist suggested. "Carrington family keeping a witch," another wrote. "She gave him honey, who heals speech with honey." The more Victor tried to silence the talk, the louder it became. Elizabeth in the crossfire. Elizabeth walked into the town market one Saturday hoping to buy fresh bread for Adrian. Instead, she was met with stares. A group of women whispered, their eyes sharp with judgment. "That's her," one murmured. "She touched the boy," another hissed. "Lord knows what kind of spirits she carries." A man spat on the ground as she passed. "Witch." Elizabeth's chest tightened, but she kept walking. She refused to let hate swallow her dignity. Still, that night, when she returned to her small servants' quarters, she sank onto her bed and cried quietly. She had only given Adrian love. How could love be turned into something dark? Adrian's shield. Adrian noticed. For all his young years, he understood more than people believed. One evening, as Elizabeth tucked him into bed, he whispered, broken but determined, "Don't cry." Elizabeth froze, tears brimmed her eyes. "You spoke for me." Adrian nodded, his small hand reaching for hers. "Liz safe." Her heart cracked open. For a boy who had lived in silence for 7 years, his few words were more powerful than the insults of an entire town. But Adrian's loyalty only fueled the rumors. "The boy is bewitched," they said. "He protects her because she controls him." Victor's war within. Victor Carrington was torn apart. On one hand, his son's progress was undeniable. Words that doctors swore would never come were blossoming. On the other, Elizabeth's growing influence cast a shadow over his carefully constructed image. Business partners started to withdraw. Investors whispered about bad energy around the Carrington family. One even said, "Victor, you've built empires, but you're letting a servant ruin you." Victor snapped at Elizabeth one night in the study. "Do you see what you've done? My empire is shaking because of you. They think my son's voice came from witchcraft." Elizabeth met his rage with quiet strength. "What shakes your empire is not me, sir. It's your fear of admitting the truth that miracles can't be bought and control can't explain everything." Victor trembled with fury, but deep down her words pierced him. Isabella's faith. Isabella, unlike her husband, saw things differently. She found Elizabeth in the chapel one evening, kneeling quietly in prayer. "I know they call you a witch," Isabella said softly, "but I believe God sent you here. I believe Adrian's voice is a miracle and you were the vessel he used." Elizabeth's tears fell. "Ma'am, I only did what any mother would do. I gave him love when the world gave him silence." Isabella embraced her. "Then know this, as long as I breathe, you will never face this fire alone." The Council of Judgment. But the fire grew. A group of community leaders requested a private meeting with Victor. They sat in his mansion, their voices dripping with both respect and threat. "Victor," one man said, "your son's healing has caused concern. This maid of yours, Elizabeth, her methods are questionable. If you want to protect your family's reputation, you must dismiss her." Victor tightened his jaw. "She's done nothing wrong." Another man leaned forward. "Perception is reality, Carrington. People believe she's a danger. If you keep her, they'll turn on you, on your businesses, on your legacy." For the first time in his life, Victor Carrington was not fighting rivals or markets. He was fighting belief itself. And belief, he realized, was far more dangerous. Elizabeth's choice. That night, Elizabeth stood at her window looking out at the sprawling Carrington estate. She could leave, protect herself from the cruelty and whispers, but then she thought of Adrian, his tiny voice calling her Liz, his fragile courage that needed nurturing. She couldn't abandon him. Even if the world hated her, she would stay. And so, as the storm of accusations grew, Elizabeth prepared herself. She would face it all, because she believed Adrian's healing was not just about speech, but about breaking chains of pride, fear, and disbelief. What none of them knew, however, was that the storm was only beginning. And soon, something far more shocking would shake the Carrington mansion to its core. The Carrington estate no longer felt like a fortress of wealth, it felt like a cage of whispers. The town's judgment had grown teeth, and Elizabeth was its target. For weeks, rumors spun like wildfire that she mixed herbs under the moonlight, that she had bewitched Adrian with honey, that the boy's sudden speech was unnatural. The mansion's gates became a spectacle. Journalists camped outside, shouting questions at the family. Protesters held signs that read, "Protect the boy and send the witch away." Inside, tension strangled every hallway. Isabella tried to shield Elizabeth, but Victor grew colder, retreating into his study with bottles of wine and walls of denial. Adrian, meanwhile, was caught in the middle. The boy who had once been silent now wanted to speak, but every word came with fear, as if the world might steal his fragile gift away. The public confrontation. It was on a Sunday morning that the storm broke open. Victor insisted the family attend church, hoping to prove to the community that the Carringtons were still respectable. Elizabeth went along, hesitant but unwilling to leave Adrian's side. The church was packed. As the family entered, whispers filled the pews. Eyes narrowed at Elizabeth. The preacher's voice trembled as he welcomed them, trying to keep control. Midway through the service, a woman stood abruptly. "Reverend, how can we sit here in silence when a witch sits among us?" Gasps rippled through the congregation. All eyes turned to Elizabeth. "She gave the boy honey," the woman cried. "Honey, and now he speaks. Tell me that isn't sorcery." Elizabeth rose slowly, her dignity unshaken. "I gave him love," she said softly, her voice steady. "Love and honey, nothing more." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. Murmurs turned to accusations. "Witch, send her away, protect the boy." Adrian clutched Elizabeth's hand, shaking with fear. Then, with all the courage he could muster, he stood on the pew and shouted, his voice cracking but loud enough for all to hear. "She is not a witch, she saved me." The church froze. The boy who had been silent for 7 years was shouting. His words, broken but fierce, cut through the noise. Tears streamed down Isabella's face. Even Victor's heart clenched in awe. But not everyone was moved, some whispered even louder. The boy defends her because she controls him. Elizabeth knew then that the storm would not pass easily. Victor's breaking point. That night, Victor confronted Elizabeth in the study. His face was pale, his voice shaking. "You've put my family in danger," he said. "My businesses are falling, my name is being dragged through mud, investors are fleeing, and all because of you." Elizabeth stood tall, though her heart ached. "No, sir, all because of your fear of admitting that something greater than money saved your son." Victor's hands trembled as he poured himself a drink. "You don't understand, I built this empire from nothing, I control everything, and now I can't explain what's happening." Elizabeth's voice softened. Maybe that's the point, maybe Adrian's voice was never meant to be explained. Maybe it was meant to teach you that life isn't about control but faith. Victor turned away, but her words echoed in him like thunder. For the first time, he wasn't the master of the story, he was part of something he couldn't buy, bend, or bury. The night of the flames. 2 nights later, the storm turned violent. As Elizabeth prepared Adrian for bed, the mansion's alarms blared, smoke filled the halls, flames licked the curtains. Someone had set fire to the estate. Chaos erupted, servants screamed, Isabella shouted for help, and Victor barked orders. But in the middle of it all, Adrian froze, paralyzed by fear. Elizabeth scooped him up, wrapping him in a blanket. "Hold on to me, baby," she whispered, carrying him through the smoke. When they reached the garden, the family gathered, coughing and gasping. The fire spread quickly, lighting up the night sky. Reporters outside snapped photos of the chaos. Then, through the smoke, a shadowy figure fled the grounds, a protester who had broken into the estate, leaving destruction in their wake. Victor stared at the fire, his empire literally burning. But when he turned and saw Elizabeth kneeling in the grass, cradling his son safely in her arms, his heart broke in a different way. She had risked everything for Adrian, not for money, not for power, but for love. The turning of a father. As firefighters battled the flames, Victor dropped to his knees beside Elizabeth. For the first time in his life, he bowed his head. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I was wrong. You saved him, you saved us, and I don't deserve your forgiveness." Elizabeth looked at him, tears in her eyes. "This was never about you deserving anything, Mr. Carrington. It was about Adrian finally being free." Victor wept openly, his pride crumbling into ash like the mansion behind him. And as dawn broke over the ruined estate, one truth became clear. The real fire was not the one that burned the house, it was the one that had burned away Victor's disbelief. But just as the family began to find hope, the world outside was not ready to forgive. Reporters framed Elizabeth as both hero and villain, and the whispers of witchcraft refused to die. The stage was set for a final, shocking twist, one that would force Victor, Elizabeth, and Adrian to face the world head-on, no matter the cost. The Carrington estate still smelled of smoke. The once proud mansion stood half-charred, its marble stained with soot. Reporters circled like vultures, eager for another headline. The town was divided. Some saw Elizabeth as a savior, others branded her the reason behind the chaos. For Elizabeth, it was a test of faith. She kept close to Adrian, her quiet strength shielding him from the storm, yet whispers grew louder each day, and soon whispers turned into summons. The gathering of judgment. A town council meeting was called. Though it wasn't an official court, the gathering felt like a trial. Hundreds crowded into the town hall, their voices sharp with suspicion. At the front sat the Carrington family, Victor, grim and weary, Isabella, pale but resolute, Adrian clutching Elizabeth's hand, and Elizabeth herself standing tall though the room bristled with hostility. The mayor spoke first. "This community demands answers. How did this boy, silent for 7 years, suddenly find his voice under the care of this woman? We cannot ignore the strange circumstances." Voices erupted from the crowd. "She bewitched him. It's unnatural. She must go." Elizabeth raised her chin. "I did not bewitch anyone. I gave him love, I gave him honey, and I prayed with all my heart. That is the truth." But her words were swallowed by jeers, lies, sorcery. Victor stood, his hands trembling. For years he had commanded boardrooms and silenced rivals, but this crowd. Driven by fear, nearly swallowed him whole. He wanted to defend Elizabeth, but pride choked his throat. Until a small, clear voice pierced the chaos. "Adrian, stand." Adrian stepped forward, trembling but determined. His lips moved slowly, painfully, but words came. "She is not a witch." The room fell silent. Adrian's blue eyes scanned the crowd, his tiny chest heaving. "She gave me honey, she gave me love." He looked at his father. "Papa, I speak because she believed." Gasps echoed, tears welled in Isabella's eyes. Elizabeth covered her mouth, her heart breaking open. And then Adrian did something no one expected. He began to sing. The melody was fragile, broken, but beautiful. His voice, thin but pure, rose through the hall like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The crowd that had branded him bewitched now listened in stunned silence. When the last note faded, the hall was still. No one could deny what they had witnessed, not witchcraft but a miracle born of love. Victor's redemption. Victor rose slowly, his voice unsteady. "You want to know the truth? My son was silent for 7 years. I paid the best doctors, the brightest minds, and none of them could help him. And then this woman, Elizabeth Monroe, walked into our home. She didn't bring science or wealth or magic. She brought faith. She brought love." He paused, his eyes wet. "And because of her, my boy calls me Papa. If you call that witchcraft, then maybe we've all forgotten what a miracle really looks like." The hall was silent. Slowly one person clapped, then another. Soon the room thundered with applause. Not everyone was convinced, but enough were silenced. Elizabeth was no longer just a maid. She was the woman who gave a boy his voice and in doing so gave a father his heart. The reward of love. Days later, Victor called Elizabeth into what remained of his study. Papers and smoke-stained books cluttered the room, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "I can't repay you for what you've done, but I want to try. Name anything, money, a house, anything, and it's yours." Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't need riches, Mr. Carrington. All I want is for Adrian to keep growing, to keep speaking, to keep believing in himself. That's my reward." Victor's voice cracked. "Then stay, not as a maid, as his tutor, his guide, as part of this family." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. For the first time, Victor wasn't offering money, he was offering respect. She nodded. "I'll stay." A new beginning. Months passed. The mansion was rebuilt, but more importantly, so was the Carrington family. Laughter filled the halls again. Adrian's voice grew stronger every day, his words becoming fuller, his songs clearer. Elizabeth sat by the piano one afternoon as Adrian played clumsy notes, giggling when he missed a key. Victor stood by the doorway, watching with a soft smile. He no longer scoffed at the word miracle. Instead, he whispered it to himself every time he heard his son's voice. And so, the Carrington estate was no longer a monument to wealth, it was a home. Not because of marble pillars or sprawling gardens, but because love, faith, and a spoon of honey had healed what money never could. Elizabeth had come to the mansion as a maid, but she had become something far greater, the voice that gave the silent boy his song, the healer of a broken family, and the living proof that miracles still walked among men.